My friend, British ales. So this is a category of beer that we are just now touching on for the first time on the Beer Brackets channel. If you haven't seen it yet, check out our review of Fuller's London Pride. I'll post a link down to that just below. You know, we've tackled a whole bunch of different categories of beers. We've talked about Flemish red ales. We've talked about wheat beers. We've dissected the difference between lagers and pilsners. There are so many different types of beers that we've jumped on so far. Using a general term like British ale, it's extremely general, and there's so much that goes into that. I mean, in the review, I kind of touched on the fact of how a lot of British ales traditionally are based off the kind of pale ale model, and they go by the name bitter, coming from the high hop presence that you get out of a pale ale, and there's a whole bunch of classifications that come from that. All to say that, they're a little darker, they're a little bit more flavorful than, let's say, a lager or a pilsner, but there is so much more to it than that, right? And I think you, if anybody's going to explain this to our viewers, my friend, I think it's you. So if somebody didn't know what a British ale was, what would you tell them?
Like you said, this is exploring a whole new world. So
a whole new world.
Yes.
A beautiful world.
Yeah. A beautiful world, exactly, because it's made out of beer. What you described is the perfect introduction. So we're talking about,
thank you.
In general, ales versus lagers. So we're talking about a different type of yeast. So we're talking about top fermentation, like in the ales, while pilsner and lagers usually use bottom fermentation at a cooler temperature. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Like you said, we're talking mainly about pale ales that use hops in a different way. So they're a little bit more prominent, a little bit more present. A lot of the British ales use hops that are grown, obviously, in England. And those hops have particular aromas. So you are going to usually see dark fruits in the descriptors, earthiness. All of those are typical of English hops. But this, again, it's a very general topic. One of the things that I would like to point out, in this description, is a specific category, which is the real ale category. Which is an incredible and amazing category that almost got lost if it wasn't for an organization called Camera that in the late 70s, early 80s, really thought to keep this style that was going away and really disappearing from going lost and be lost forever in the mists of time. And what real ales are is it's specifically an ale that is once it's produced in the brewery, it's unfiltered, unpasteurized, and it's moved into a secondary fermentation vessel that it's usually like a container, like a cask, where the yeast, being still present, continues its process of secondary fermentation within the cask. The cask is then brought over to the local pub where I like to call it the keeper of the ales decides when it's the right time to open the cask, and you need to have a specific room at a specific temperature. When it's time, you open the cask. But unlike normal kegs where you have a combination of carbonation and nitrogen and other elements to add to the beer or you get all that fizzy head, the only carbonation present is the one that is within the cask. So that's why they're called real ales, because they're still alive when they get to the pub. So it's a whole different world. And obviously this opens up a completely different scenario of where was the cask? What was the pub? What are the best pubs that are able to keep the perfect condition for the ale, and so on and so forth. And obviously being a live beer, it only has a certain amount of time before it will start spoiling. And also the classic, gravity system where you're pumping up the beer without introducing any carbonation. All these are elements that would have gone lost if it wasn't for Camera. So that's another one of the other great elements and many stories and legends that we could start talking about once we get into the topic of English ales.
So we talk about how they're using locally grown hops. So I'm sure that factors into it in a lot of ways. Do you have any knowledge as to why this style was a little bit more favored over, let's say, styles out of, Eastern Europe, like the Pilsner or the lager, something a little bit more light, a little bit more blonde? Is there anything there as to why this is the style of choice in the UK?
I think that one of the main thing is tradition between, for sure, like the ale type of fermentation is a little bit easier to achieve because it doesn't require temperature control. It doesn't require specific strains of yeast.
That makes sense.
So that as in general is probably the oldest style of beer in existence because it's easier to produce. Now, if you are talking specifically about the type of hops that are used, then I think that that's where preference starts to come into play. I think that it's kind of like an acquired taste, right? Something that people in England in particular are used to. And at first, I have to say, the first couple of times that I was, lucky enough to go visit, it is a little foreign coming from, mainly lager and pilsner countries. You approach this as a completely different style, and it takes a moment, like to get used to. But once you know it and you really fall in love with it, because there's so many small variances, like, and it's depending on what pub you go and what type of ale you have, like, it's so beautiful and it's so diverse. So it's definitely worth exploring.
Well, there you go, guys. The perfect beer for a cold night to settle into a nice cozy pub in front of an open fire, have the bartender pull you a pint of a delicious British ale. You can't go wrong.